All right, so we are going to start our chapter on the nervous system and neurons and neuron physiology. So we're going to start by talking about just generally how the nervous system is organized. So it's divided into two kind of different sections. So we have the central nervous system and we have the peripheral nervous system. All right, so the central nervous system, or the CNS, is going to consist of the brain, right, and the spinal cord. Okay, so with the central nervous system, right, we're simply referring to the brain itself and all the neurons inside of it, and just the spinal cord here itself. Okay, so that is the central nervous system. With the central nervous system, we refer to information as traveling in an either ascending or descending path. All right, so ascending means it's going to be traveling upwards. All right, so think of it as being, towards the brain. All right, so we could have ascending like this. All right, and so these are typically going to be sensory impulses. Okay, so this is going to be sensory information is going to be ascending. If you think about that, sensory information is going to come from outside of the central nervous system, somewhere in the body, move towards the spinal cord, and then go up towards the brain. All right, so sensory information is going to be ascending, and then descending means downward. All right, so this would be information coming from the brain being sent out through the spinal cord, all right, and it'll be sent down to wherever the nerves are that it's supposed to go through. And this is going to be motor information. Okay, and then we also have some kind of special terms. We refer to certain things when they're in the central nervous system by a different name than we do with the peripheral nervous system. So in the central nervous system, a bundle of axons is called a tract or tracts. All right, this is a bundle of axons in the PNS, the CNS. Okay, and we're going to go through in detail the structure of a neuron, all right? But just kind of as an overview, if we were to just draw, a simple little neuron here, all right, like this, and they have kind of these little feet coming off, all right? And this would be where the nucleus is. So with a neuron, and we'll talk about it again in more detail, you have your cell body, all right, or soma, and it has dendrites coming off of it. Okay, and then you have the axon that extends from that. All right, so that's what we're going to be talking about. So the axon, and they can be very, very long, all right? And so the axons are how neurons send information out great distances. So they'll send out like a really long axon. So when we're in the central nervous system and we have a bundle of axons, we call that a tract, all right? And then we have a cluster of cell bodies. We call that a nucleus, or plural would be nuclei. All right, so this is a cluster of cell bodies. All right, good. Specifically in the CNS. Okay, so that's the central nervous system, so the brain and spinal cord, and then you can have axons in the brain and spinal cord, and you can have clusters of cell bodies in the brain and spinal cord, and they get their own special name. All right, so now the peripheral nervous system, it is made up of nerves, right? So these are going to be nerves that are, they're going to be leaving or entering, the CNS. Okay, and they'll be bringing information from, if we're talking about in a sensory manner, right, from receptors. So way out, at the skin or in certain organs, there'll be receptors, and these are for sensation. Okay, and you'll learn throughout ANP2 a bunch of different receptors that sense different things. We talked about some touch receptors when we did the skin. All right, so these would be for lots of different types of sensation. Okay. All right, so if we're looking at the picture here, all right, so our PNS would be all of this yellow. All right, so these would be some nerves coming from the brain directly, right? Those are called cranial nerves. We're going to talk about those. And then we have nerves that come from the spinal cord. All of these yellow nerves, those are called spinal nerves. Okay, so you can have cranial coming from the brain or spinal nerves. And then they'll branch into smaller and smaller branches as they go towards whatever their target is. Okay, good. And so similar to our ascending and descending with our central nervous system, we have afferent and efferent for the peripheral nervous system. So an afferent impulse would be an impulse that is moving towards the CNS, right? And this is typically going to be sensory information. Okay, so let's say, somebody touched you on your shoulder out here, right? A receptor would feel that. It would send that information towards the spinal cord. That's going to be afferent, all right? Then it would reach the spinal cord. Now it's in the CNS, and it's going to ascend, okay? So sensory information is afferent and ascending, all right? And then efferent means that it's going to be leaving, or I think it's easier to remember, it's exiting, because it starts with an E2, the CNS. Okay, and that's going to typically be motor information. Okay, so motor information usually, especially if we're talking about voluntary motor information, starts in the brain. The brain sends that signal down, so that's descending. All right, and then it will leave the spinal cord and go out to whatever muscle it's telling to move. And so that would be efferent, right? So descending and efferent. Okay. And so in the peripheral nervous system, we call a bundle of axons nerves. All right, so this is our word in the peripheral nervous system. So this is a bundle of axons. Okay, so all of these yellow things here that we're calling, like, these are spinal nerves, and we had our cranial nerves. These are bundles of axons, okay? And then we call a collection of cell bodies, a cluster of cell bodies, a ganglion. All right, so this is a cluster of cell bodies. Okay, and so you can actually see an example of a ganglion here, and we're going to talk about it when we do the spinal cord, all right? But you can see this kind of, let me zoom in a little, all right? Coming off the spinal cord, we have this little bulge here, all right, just before our nerve. Okay, so that's our nerve, those little threads coming out. But that little bulge, that's a ganglion. So there'd be a bunch of little cell bodies there. So ganglion, nerve, okay? All right, and we'll learn what that ganglion is later. All right, so that's our peripheral nervous system. Okay, so just to kind of review, all right, when we're talking about sensory impulses, they're going to start at some sort of receptor. They're going to move afferent towards the spinal cord or the brain, all right, and then they're going to ascend and go upwards towards whatever brain region is going to interpret them, all right, so that's where they end, is in the brain. Motor impulses are going to start in the brain. They're going to descend down through the spinal cord, and then they're going to move efferent away from the central nervous system towards the muscle that they're controlling. Okay, so make sure you keep those terms straight in your mind, all right? And you also remember that afferent, right, is PNS, efferent is PNS, and descending and ascending are referring to the central nervous system. Okay? All right, and so with motor impulses, one other kind of important thing to note is that motor information can either be autonomic or it can be somatic. And so autonomic refers to involuntary motor impulses. All right, so this is involuntary motor. So this would be referring to like smooth and cardiac muscle. Okay, so whenever you hear autonomic, that's going to be controlling those involuntary muscles, and somatic is always going to be referring to voluntary motor. So this would be skeletal muscle. Okay, and the information comes from different places in the brain. So the somatic impulses start from a different part of the brain than the autonomic impulses do. And we'll talk about that in a later chapter. Okay. All right. And so kind of an overview of neuron function really quick. So neurons, as we said, they could be motor, right? That motor could be autonomic or somatic. They could be sensory. So that's sensing anything from touch to blood pressure to the level of different, chemicals, carbon dioxide, oxygen, things like that. All right. All of that is sensory. Or they can be integrative, right? So neurons can be integrative, meaning they connect sensory and motor information together. Okay, so those are kind of our three possible functions for a neuron. All right, now let's talk about glial cells. So those were neurons. All right, remember from our nervous system we talked about, or our nervous tissue we talked about with our tissue chapter, you can have neurons and you can have those support cells, the glial cells. Let's talk about the types of glial cells. All right, so you're going to have different glial cells in the central nervous system versus the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so let's start in the central nervous system. So in the brain and then the spinal cord, our first type of glial cell is called an astrocyte. All right, and so this is our astrocyte over here. All right, it's a cell with a bunch of different branches, kind of like these feet, right, that it sends out. And what it does with those feet, right, it's going to wrap its little feet around blood vessels in your brain and spinal cord. Okay, so you can see this red here is a blood vessel, and it's got its feet all wrapped on top of it. And so by doing that, it creates the blood-brain barrier. Okay, so the blood-brain barrier is critical because it is what determines what gets from your blood to your brain, right? It has access to your neurons. What kind of chemicals and, drugs and things like that can actually get to your neurons. Okay. So it determines what can pass from the blood into that interstitial fluid around your neurons. So very, very important function, creating that blood-brain barrier. All right. And it's also something that's very important to be aware of in medicine, because certain drugs that act on the brain, you have to make sure that they can actually pass through that blood-brain barrier. Otherwise, they're not going to be effective on the brain. All right, so drugs meant to act on the central nervous system have to be able to pass through that blood-brain barrier. Okay, these astrocytes also have a couple other functions. All right, so they help neurons develop. All right, so as neurons are developing, these astrocytes are going to kind of help them develop and guide them as they send out like their axons and make connections. They're going to help with that. Okay, and then they're also really important in healing. So neurons, as we know, can't undergo mitosis. They can't replace themselves, right? But they can kind of repair themselves. So if, you get some sort of injury that, maybe cuts through a nerve, right? It is possible, depending on the nerve and where it's located, for that nerve to reform, right? So to kind of like stitch those axons back together. And so astrocytes can help with that. All All right. And then they also help with removing neurotransmitters. So when neurons talk to each other, right, they release neurotransmitters similar to what we talked about with the neuromuscular junction. And so they help to take that neurotransmitter so it's not just staying, in that synapse. It'll help to remove it. Okay. Good. So our next glial cell for the central nervous system is a microglia or microglia. All right. This is a type of macrophage. And so we know macrophages eat things. All right. They're actually derived from a specific type of white blood cell. All macrophages in the body are. All right. And so it's going to clean up debris and kind of, keep that interstitial fluid around the neurons nice and clean. Okay. So that's our microglia. And then we have our ependymal cells. All right, so these are our ependymal cells. So they look like little kind of cuboidal or columnar cells, and they have these really long cilia. Okay, and so what these cilia can do is they can move, right? They can kind of like beat and move, and you can see kind of in this picture, right? They're creating this current in the fluid that sits on top of them. Okay, and so that's actually their function. So they line the spaces in the CNS that are full of cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, and they help to move and circulate that fluid. All right, so the fluid we're talking about here is the CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, which we're going to talk about more when we go through the brain itself. Okay, but they're going to sit in those spaces where that fluid is located and beat their little cilia and create this current to help that CSF move through those fluid-filled spaces. Okay, good. Then our last type of cell for the CNS is an oligodendrocyte. All right, we're going to spend some extra time on this cell and its kind of counterpart in the PNS. All right, so the oligodendrocyte is going to be the cell in the CNS that's responsible for making the myelin sheath. Okay, and so the myelin sheath, I'm actually going to highlight it here, right? So myelin sheath, very important concept. And what it is kind of this wrapping, all right, around an axon. So you can kind of see in yellow here, right? This is the axon of a neuron. And what this oligodendrocyte does is it'll send out like a little arm and it'll wrap layers and layers and layers of its cell membrane around that axon. Okay, and so that'll help to insulate the axon. All right, so we're going to talk about the myelin a little more later, all right? But in the CNS, oligodendrocytes are going to make the myelin, all right? And they're kind of special compared to the PNS because one oligodendrocyte cell can make many myelin beads. All right, so you can see this oligodendrocyte, all right, is making 3. So we have 1, we have 2, and we have 3. All right, this one's making 4, and so on. So they can make more than just one each cell. Okay, so that's in the CNS, our oligodendrocytes. Now let's talk about the cells in the PNS. All right, so in the PNS, we have satellite cells. Okay, and so these satellite cells are going to be here in this picture. All right, they're these purple cells around that cell body or soma of the neuron. So they sit around the neuron. They're located in the ganglion. Remember where those cell bodies are kind of clustered in the PNS? So they're in the ganglion around the cell body, and they just help to kind of regulate that environment around the cell. So kind of like what the astrocytes do in the CNS, that's kind of what these guys do in the PNS, except they don't create any kind of blood-brain barrier, right? They just regulate that environment around the cell. Okay. And then we only have 2 cells in the PNS to talk about. Our second type of cell is a Schwann cell. Okay, and so a Schwann cell is going to be each of these little blue beads, each of these myelin beads. So they actually would each have their own little nucleus. All right, so every blue bead is a separate Schwann cell. All right, so the Schwann cells form the myelin sheath in the PNS. All right, and they're unique because each cell creates one myelin bead. Okay, so every single one of these is a separate Schwann cell. All right, and that's different from our oligodendrocytes, which one cell can make many myelin beads. Okay? All right, so those are all of our glial cells in the CNS and our PNS. So we're going to stop there for this video. And in the next video, we're going to pick it up and talk about structure of a neuron as a whole. Okay.